First and foremost, explain the fundamental differences, or are there fundamental differences between ISIS and or ISIS-K and the Taliban?
So the Taliban is an organization that formed in the 1980s in the southern part of Afghanistan and the northern part of Pakistan, largely populated by Pashtun peoples, mountain peoples from that region. They began their organization as the resistance to Soviet influence in the area, and then they continued that with the resistance to other foreigners, including the United States, and their resistance to northern Afghans who are of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. So that's the Taliban. ISIS grows out of the war in Iraq. And ISIS begins as an Islamic group resisting American activities in Iraq and in Syria. And they are part of the insurgency against the American occupation of Iraq. For a time, they establish a political control within parts of Iraq and Syria. And they have slowly spread in certain ways throughout the region. They have less power than they had before, but they're more diffuse. But most members of ISIS and ISIS-K are not actually from Afghanistan or even from Pakistan.
So this conflict then appears to be more regional than philosophical. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that the conflict is largely regional and ethnic. The Taliban come from a different ethnic background as those who are part of ISIS and those who are part of the Afghan Defense Forces. We have northern Afghans who come from various groups who have worked in some respects with the United States. They used to be part of a group called the Northern Alliance. Then we have the southern Afghans, the Pashtuns, who are a large part of the Taliban. And then we have individuals who are also Muslim, but ethnically, they come from other areas. They have different historical background. They have different features. They're different tribes if you go back far enough. And they are coming into Afghanistan also to fight foreigners, but with a different set of goals in mind.
I don't want to be reductive here. I want to make sure we're clear that these are both Sunni Muslims, correct?
Correct. These are Sunni Muslim groups that are part of a Salafist movement, which is seeking to expel foreigners from the region and, quite frankly, seeking to expel the wrong Muslims, as they see it, from the region. So they do share certain ideological goals, but they're very different in their makeup. And what's very important to understand is that the Taliban wants to rule Afghanistan. They don't want ISIS to rule Afghanistan. And ISIS wants to rule Afghanistan, and they're not really supportive of the Taliban.
In practice, how are they different? How do they go about ruling a country differently? What, I guess, part of what I'm asking is, what are their goals? How are their goals different?
Well, it's hard to know exactly how their goals have evolved in recent months, but it does appear that the Taliban wants to get the United States out of Afghanistan, and they want to set up a new state. They want to rule Afghanistan. They want to rule it harshly with their own restrictions on women and various other things, but they want a functioning state. And here's the most important thing: they want foreign aid. They still want to be able to trade with foreign countries. About 70% of Afghanistan's budget comes from outside of Afghanistan in the form of foreign aid from the United States, from China, from the European Union, from Russia. And they still want a lot of that money. So they want to form a functioning state with functioning institutions in their own extreme way. ISIS has not shown an interest in building a traditional state. They want to build a larger regional Muslim empire, in a sense. And so they want to rule Afghanistan as part of something larger. They're not as concerned with the foreign aid, with the institutions of Afghanistan. So I think you see two very different goals there. You can think of the Taliban as a replacement to the Afghan state. You can think of ISIS as seeking to bring the Afghan state into a regional revolution, which might not involve a state in Afghanistan.
That would be a caliphate, right? Where
Correct. Yeah. Correct. That would be a caliphate, and it would involve crossing borders. So ISIS, when they ruled in Syria and Iraq and parts of Syria and Iraq, they didn't seek to create different states. They sought to make that all part of one larger caliphate, as you said, one larger empire. It's the difference between wanting to create a modern set of institutions or wanting to go back to some set of institutions that are not defined by what we would recognize today as functioning bureaucracies and functioning institutions. The Taliban wants institutions. They just want them to be their institutions. We might find them offensive, but they still are institutions they want to use to rule that state. ISIS wants to control the region, doesn't care as much what kind of state Afghanistan has.
Obviously, neither is Democratic or Republican, but as in the form of government. But who's in charge? Is there a single leader? Is it a I don't know, a panel? How do those sort of the way the governments work or lack thereof, how do they differ?
So the Taliban has a very clear hierarchy. And the Trump administration, in fact, released the leader of the Taliban from jail, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with him personally and negotiated with him the same way you would negotiate with the leader of some other country or some other movement. So they have a clear hierarchy. They have people who are defined as a minister of defense, as a minister of state. So they function in that way that's recognizable to us. ISIS does not do that. They have people who have different roles. They have a hierarchy, but they don't define themselves in terms of state functions. They define themselves in terms of a world revolution. And they're built around the idea of spreading their faith, spreading violence, undermining existing institutions. So their titles tend to be more titles that are along the lines of military activity rather than along the lines of governance, as we would see it today.
So they don't care about government, they care about power.
Yeah, they want to control areas, there's no doubt, but they're not seeking to build a discrete region that can function on its own. They don't want that. They want to actually see it connect to other areas. Whereas the Taliban wants to be able to rule this thing we call Afghanistan. They want to control that on the map, control the resources, and use them for their purposes. ISIS is less concerned about what happens in Afghanistan. It wants to use Afghanistan as part of a step to some kind of larger revolution. So in a sense, the Taliban is building dams and ISIS is trying to create a flood.
So then when the US gets out of Afghanistan, how did that sort of create, what domino effect did that create where we see what we saw today? Is it just destabilization and all of a sudden ISIS sees a way to maybe take a next step and create that flow?
Yes, I think what the United States was doing in Afghanistan for 20 years is trying to build an alternative state to the Taliban. That obviously didn't work. But what we were doing effectively was we were sort of playing the role of policemen on the ground. We were keeping order. You can still have gangs operating in the neighborhood, but the police put a limit on the violence. That's what we were doing. We were a policing force. The police have left. We're in the process of leaving. And as the police have left, the largest gang, the Taliban, have come in. We actually negotiated with them, as police often negotiate with gangs, to create some rules to protect our soldiers as we left. Promise that they wouldn't allow Al-Qaeda or ISIS to operate in ways that would threaten the United States. And so far, it looks like the Taliban has largely kept those agreements. Who knows if they will going forward. ISIS has moved in as a smaller gang. They've used the absence of the police to be able to move in, and they are starting fires in the neighborhood. As the bigger gang is trying to establish order and put itself in charge, ISIS is putting up and starting its own fires.
So it's a turf war then, and the US was pretty much the only one preventing it from being a turf war.
That's exactly right. It's a turf war. The United States was maintaining order, and as the United States has left, now the gangs are fighting more. Some parts of each gang might cooperate, but as a whole, they have very different interests. Taliban want a state, ISIS wants a revolution.
Okay, so again, don't want to be reductive here, and I recognize the nuance and complexity to all of this, but it seems to me like the US would favor the Taliban over ISIS as far as control in Afghanistan, given the Taliban's lean toward diplomacy.
So far, for the last 2 years, as we've negotiated our way out of Afghanistan, the Trump administration and the Biden administration have both favored the Taliban as a partner, not a partner we like. In the world of international affairs, sometimes you have to work with people you hate, but we have seen them as a force that we could make certain deals with. Remember, Donald Trump almost invited, in fact, wanted to bring the leader of the Taliban to Camp David. So we saw them as someone we could work with, someone we could do business with. We've never seen ISIS as a group we could do business with because they don't have as clear a hierarchy and because they're not determined to try to build anything. They want to tear everything down. If the police are leaving the neighborhood, you want another gang to step in and at least provide some order. You don't want the group that's just trying to set the whole neighborhood on fire to be in charge. And that's why we have favored, when we've had to, the Taliban over ISIS.
What's next?
So I think in the short run, the main American aim is to try to work with the Taliban to continue to get Americans and American allies out of Afghanistan. We've taken about 100,000 people out. We're hoping to take more out. It's an incredibly large number. And so we're working with the Taliban. ISIS has no interest, it appears, to help us with that at all. And we want the Taliban to work with us to prevent ISIS from doing more damage, as they did today with these awful bombings at the Kabul airport. Going down the line, though, in months and years from now, the American goal is actually to contain what happens in Afghanistan. It's not going to be up to the United States to keep ISIS out, I don't think. At the moment, we're not going to try to change what the Taliban does on the ground. We will condemn their mistreatment of people, but our main goal is going to be to contain the issue. So to prevent any activity in Afghanistan that can create harm in the wider region. And of course, we want to prevent any activity that could create harm in the United States.
We would want to prevent them from moving into Pakistan or expanding their state.
Correct. And the informal agreement might be, as much as we hate what they're doing in Afghanistan, as long as it stays in Afghanistan, we won't try to get in the way.
People are familiar with Al-Qaeda, with Boko Haram, with ISIS, and with the Taliban. How are Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram different from these two? My understanding is that's regional also.
Correct.
Too. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, I think Al-Qaeda grows out of the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, but it is a movement that is based largely on the Middle East, on the protection of the Holy Lands. And Osama bin Laden, one of the key figures in the creation of Al-Qaeda, his anger was that there were heathens, Americans and others, in the Holy Lands. Its goal, Al-Qaeda, is to get all the heathens out of what it sees as the Holy Lands of the Middle East. Boko Haram is influenced by Al-Qaeda, but it has a totally different set of goals, which is to eradicate non-Boko Haram members, non-Muslims, from its part of Africa. But neither Boko Haram nor Al-Qaeda are seeking to bring their revolution to other parts of the world. They're actually just seeking to eradicate the people who they don't want in their part of the world.
Which makes them more similar than to the Taliban than ISIS.
Correct. I think that what the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram all have in common is that they are trying to rule their particular territory. They're space-specific, they're regional. They have territory that they see as particularly holy that they want to do something with, whereas ISIS sees itself as on a mission to spread Islam within the region and beyond.
The U.S. got out of this thing because it was obvious and apparent that they were not going to win the war. It was a forever war. Now it appears that today's action is just sparking a new and larger conflict that it was already sort of sizzling, but is boiling now between ISIS and the Taliban. So did the U.S. just sort of inadvertently start another forever war that we're just not going to be involved in?
Well, no, I think this is a region, and Afghanistan is a place that's been in a prolonged civil war from before the time we arrived. Our failure has been to end that civil war and build something in its place. But what we're seeing as we leave is the country is returning to some of the conflicts it's had for the last 30 to 40 years between different groups. And we shouldn't be surprised to see that, right? Our effort was to create a common Afghan identity that doesn't exist. There are different groups fighting for control of this space. And as we leave, those groups will fight even more. In fact, the one thing that might have come out of our being there is that we're leaving behind a lot of equipment and a lot of people who have only grown up seeing this kind of warfare. So it might have actually increased the amount of violence. But we didn't create these different factions. These factions have grown out of the different points of view, the different ethnic and regional backgrounds within Afghanistan and within the region.
You mentioned the sort of the fight against the Soviet Union in the 80s and into the 90s. The U.S. was sort of supporting Mujahideen.
Correct.
In the fight. And that, I'm trying to think of this as a flow chart where you've got sort of Mujahideen that then splits into Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. I don't know if Boko Haram was so much involved in that because
no, that's later on.
Russia, right? But is that fair that it was sort of at one point the U.S. was supporting, this Mujahideen as the top part of the flow chart, and then they split off?
Yeah. Okay. You could argue that the civil war Afghanistan has been in grows out of the Soviet experience. It actually grows out of the Soviet efforts to put a communist regime in place in the early 1970s, which led to the Soviet intervention in 1979, which radicalized all of these other groups. These different tribes in Afghanistan, they've long had conflict between one another, but they didn't always fight in the way they've been fighting now. So it's wrong to see this as a historic place of forever fighting. No, that's not right, right? These were groups that might not have liked each other, but they had a king and they kind of got along. The Soviets implanted a communist regime, which triggered a set of militarized responses. And in that crucible of warfare that continued for more than a decade, different militarized factions formed. Then we stepped into that. Right. And I think in some ways, those militarized factions have become even more militarized.
I guess it seems like the Soviets came in and tried to institute a common form of government among peoples in the same way that the US did. You know, it was just communism versus democracy. I mean, is that fair too, where the Soviets?
I think so. I think the distinction, there are a lot of similarities, but the important distinction is the Soviets are trying to create a system that they were going to impose on people in there. Right. I mean, the idea was to create a worker state in a country that didn't have workers, right? I mean, so this was an imposed regime. They were imposing because they thought it was the right thing for this poor country, right? But that was being imposed. The United States was hoping to create a regime that would be democratic, but on Afghan terms, where Afghanis would have the ability to rule themselves and to make choices for themselves. We didn't tell them that they had to do things the way we wanted them to do them. We wanted them to have a system that was set up that was orderly, peaceful, and wouldn't threaten its neighbors. It doesn't make us any more successful, but I do think the aims were different in those cases.
Jeremy, anything you would like to add?
That this is not about Christianity versus Islam, right? Many of the people who we are evacuating are Muslim. They are Muslims who have worked with the United States, who have worked and prayed for a better Afghanistan, and many of the victims who will be left behind. The Taliban and ISIS will kill far more Muslims than non-Muslims. So this is not the Muslim world against our world. That's not the way to think about this. The way to think about this is it's groups of many, many different kinds of families, many different gangs fighting over the same territory. And in fact, religion is not what's motivating this. Religion is used as a tool. But it's not about religion, it's about control of land and control of people.